In theory, something like this has always worked. One-shotting bosses with a glass cannon build in hardcore. I mean, what could go wrong? Just never screw up, right? And you know what? So far I haven't. I farmed about 150 Uber bosses with this build so far, on a relatively budget setup, and nothing's gone wrong. Yet. So let's talk about the build. Before we get into the details of it, let's go over my skill rotation. I drop a Curse Crown LE Weakness, pop on my Flask, pop Zealotry, Righteous Fire, Bear Trap, throw all my Ice Traps, walk forward, Bear Trap again, throw more Ice Traps, pop Bottled Faith, then second rotation of Flasks. Got it? Getting into the build is probably not a lot different than what you'd see in terms of the ZHP Ice Trappers on Softcore Trade. I've looked at some of them, I think it's probably quite similar. Basically, you just stack a bunch of Cluster Jewels. In each of these Cluster Jewels, you get a lot of crit multi. Use a bunch of unique items that enable this, and you're good to go. The tree should be really easy to follow since it's just travel nodes to clusters, some trap nodes, some crit multi. One thing to note is that the Timeless Jewel I'm running is for Inner Conviction. Again, pretty standard as far as Ralakesh crit builds go. Gives you extra damage per power charge, but you still get min Frenzy charges, so you don't need to worry about Frenzy charge generation. Gear-wise, I'm using Annihilating Light. This is much easier than doing the Void, Battery, and Malachi's Loop setup. That's also quite good, but you probably want to stack more to max power charges if you were to do that, say with Ring Implicits and that sort of thing. I'm using a baseline Heat Shiver, no enchant, no corruption, power charge enchant would be pretty good. GL's Malefaction is very important because this scales up your Ice Trap level and your Empower. I don't think anything really gets close to this in terms of raw damage and power. Arctic's Hand is used because I don't have enough cast speed otherwise, and I pair this with a Silver Flask and a cast speed suffix to get just enough trap throw speed that I can actually hit my trap limit before Uber bosses spawn. Ralakesh's Impatience is one of the core items for the build, giving you power, frenzy, and also endurance charge generation. I'm also running the lab enchant for damage penetration because you've never killed recently, using hit-based traps. A Badge of the Brotherhood scales that number of power charges. Again, much more powerful if you have more sources of power charges elsewhere, and I've anointed Master Sapper because one of the most important stats on this build is trap limit. Ideally, you run a large Thread of Hope here, so that you can also hit Sleight of Hand, and probably Assassination I think is hit by that, but on HC Trade at the time, there weren't a lot of Thread of Hopes and I had no Divine Orbs. For my rings, I run a Mark of the Shaper, which is just a ton of increased damage, a little bit of flat, and then pair that with an Elder Influence Ruby ring, which I've essence crafted with the Deafening Essence of Scorn until I hit a big strength suffix. Lastly, the budget belt for this is a String of Servitude, which gives you a ton of critical strike multiplier when you're using flasks. I'm always using flasks, and if they drop off on Uber bosses, I'm pretty much screwed anyway. There's certain components to the flask set that are really important. Bottled Faith is huge for this. On HC, it's about 3 divines. The Ruby Flask is really great because I can roll this quite aggressively and also put that reduced mana cost, which enables not only me to throw a lot of traps out, but also gives me enough mana cost reduction to use Divine Blessing. I opt for a Bismuth Flask, not because I need all the res, but because I just need my fire res to be high enough to sustain Righteous Fire right before I'm fighting the bosses. A Diamond Flask with cast speed gives me more damage and more trap throw speed because of Ralakesh, and finally a Silver Flask sort of does the exact same thing. My Watcher's Eye on this build is the only other piece of gear I haven't covered, and this is a double penetration Watcher's Eye. Hatred base crit would probably be pretty good for my build, considering I'm only at 90% crit chance. Although this config might be different depending on how damage calcs work on Uber bosses, but I won't really get into that. I don't really know exactly how it works. Speaking of, I don't also know that this Cursed Crown setup does work. Basically, I know for sure that Blasphemy setups don't work, and Arcanist Brand setups definitely don't work for trying to one-shot bosses. Cursed Crown might, but it might also have an issue where it works based on server ticks, so I don't know that this is applying to the bosses that I'm fighting. That said, I just run it anyway, there's no real loss. My primary damage setup is in an Ice Trap, Charge Traps, Trap Mine, Empower, Conk Effect, and Power Charge on crit. This is level 1 because I just didn't feel like leveling it up. Again, you get nothing from leveling this, so it doesn't actually matter. I throw a Bear Trap at different points of time. I actually throw 2 just in case the first one gets overcapped by trap limit. For my auras, I run Precision. There's actually no Herald of Ice. I have a Hatred, and then Skitter Bossling with Bone Chill and Unbound Ailments to scale both the shock effect from this and also the chill effect scaling with Bone Chill. I do use Frostwing on this. It's actually quite important. One of the big things to know is that when you're farming Eater of Worlds, it will always be able to get that first basic tentacle attack off unless you're really far away. But I do need to be close so that I can apply the Consecrated Ground from Bottled Faith. And then I run an Arrogance Haste to give you some trap throw speed, a Zealotry Divine Blessing setup, and then Vitality to help sustain my Righteous Fire even more. That's really all there is to this build. It does look pretty daunting because you have to make so many jewels, but if you actually look at the gear that I've set up for this character, it's all really bad. A lot of 2-prop jewels, uncorrupted items, and I think the whole thing was set up for just over 20 Divine Orbs, and that includes the Empower 4, which cost me 10 Divines. Anyways, if you want to speed through bosses as fast as humanly possible, and this only pretty much includes Exarch, Eater, and possibly Maven if you're on softcore, this is the build for you. And on softcore trade, this is really just an efficiency thing. But on hardcore, this is probably the most fun I've ever had playing a build. Because frankly, there's nothing that makes me feel more alive than being so close to death.